Hi, welcome back to lesson number 3 in the 10 surprises you need to know about stuttering. We've discussed a lot of the surprises already, and you have learned that speaking is meant to be a very automatic process, something that we don't have access to. So, if you are a person who stutters, and you have checked out how you speak, what you do when you're speaking, or what you're thinking when you're speaking, you might have found out that it's not so automatic. I'm sure you did. I'm just going to ask you a few questions about what happens when you're speaking, and I want you to just answer yes or no. Okay? You ready? When you're speaking, do you sometimes know the words you're going to say before you say them? Do you ever monitor which speech sounds are in your language so that you can try to either avoid them or control how you're going to say them? Just before you start to speak, do you plan the words or maybe the first word you're going to say? Do you think about which words are going to be hard to say or which sounds? Do you sometimes change words because you think they're going to be hard to say? These are just a few questions that I have, and if you answered yes to any of those questions, then you're not using your system completely automatically. And you know that using that system automatically is a requirement. It's not a choice if you want to speak fluently and naturally and easily. So, these are some of the things that people who stutter do. And I want to explain a little bit more about what goes on. And the things that I'm going to explain might not be applicable for all of you. And some people, even within one person, you might be doing one thing in one situation or at one time in your life, and then it changes and you do something else. Maybe you are even guided to change something about how your system functions. And you could have even practiced doing something that interfered with the normal, natural way for speaking. I know that's kind of makes you feel kind of badly that maybe I've even been practicing it. But hey guys, it's not nobody's fault here. Certainly, it's not the fault of the speaker. And you probably were trying to do something that you thought was the right thing to do. And you know what? I'm sure that a lot of the people who guided you with really good intentions, because everybody's been looking at the speech and not the system. We do know that a lot of the researchers have found that it is a system problem, and it's been written about. But unfortunately, when it comes to treating stuttering, people are still working on maybe the rate of speech or how the breathing, all of these things, gentle onsets. So, what we want to do is see what you might be doing that is interfering with the way your system is functioning. So, first of all, let's look at the thinking part. What might you be thinking about? Well, you might be thinking of the words you're going to say. And some people who stutter actually develop their speech by trying to pick the words that they're going to say. So that would be something that would be a real interference. Sometimes people try to kind of see the words in their mind's eye as they're speaking. And of course, that would take up a brain function. And that would be an interference with the normal synchronization of all the systems. So you might be thinking which sounds you're going to say or how to say them. You might be thinking, what are people thinking about me? You might be thinking, am I going to have a problem? Am I going to, unfortunately, some people think, am I going to make a fool of myself? Of course, we know that stuttering is not making a fool of yourself in any way whatsoever. Just happens to be the way your speech is when your system isn't functioning the way it's meant to function. So it's nothing to feel embarrassed about. Of course, you might say, okay, Barbara, it's easy for you to say. You're not the one stuttering. And I do understand you. I do understand where it comes from. But I also understand that if we look at it, if you can look at it a little bit more objectively, that there really isn't a reason to feel embarrassed or anything like that about stuttering. Now, we do have to educate the public, and I hope that maybe these videos are educating the general public as well about stuttering. But in any case, kind of got a little off track here. But so what are you doing? What are you doing when you stutter? Maybe thinking too much about how am I speaking, the words that I'm saying, which words, maybe changing words. And sometimes we all change words. That happens. So it does require stopping to a little bit. There's a little disfluency there as I might be changing a word of what I want to say. But it's not a regular thing, and it's not something that I do in advance. I'm not looking down the road a little bit. So if I'm going to say something like, I see you, when I say the I, I'm not thinking of the you. So it's just letting those sounds come in my head automatically. So thinking, instead of just thinking of the message, one of the things that people who stutter do is in some way look at the words, think about the words, plan the words, scan ahead for words. Another thing that often happens is that some people listen to themselves when they're speaking. So it's almost they're trying to see, did I stutter? How did that come out? Listening to how they sound. Well, you know that that's not going to make really easy to speak, because what you hear, even when it's yourself speaking and there's no delay, that there might be on a video connection or a telephone connection, but even in real time, what I am saying is heard by me a little bit after I've already said it. So, and I'm talking about milliseconds here. So that's thousands of seconds. Anyway, so it's really, really small amount of time. But it's enough to throw the system off. So listening to yourself could be another thing that you are doing that is interfering. Okay? So we discussed the words and the listening. We know that when we want to speak, we also breathe. So something that a lot of people do when they're speaking is they try to take a big deep breath so they'll have enough breath to get everything they want out. Now, that doesn't work so well because it happens naturally that when you take a big breath, you let out a big breath. And that's going to confuse the issue. It just confuses everything. Paying attention to your breathing isn't something you want to really have to do. Now, I know that sometimes when you do some breathing exercises or perhaps take that big breath, it might have an effect on other things in your system as well. So some of you who have done these breathing techniques might have found that you do stutter less. But this brings me to the next big surprise, and that is that all non-stuttered speech is not the same as naturally fluent speech. So, I don't want you to confuse techniques that help you not to stutter, but do require effort, thinking, because they're not natural. They require effort, they're tiring, they put a lot of, I don't want to say pressure, but they put something on the system that it's too much. It's too much on the system. So what I'm talking about is really the naturally fluent speaking. That speaking that just flows, which is different. So I want you to realize that there is a big difference. And there are other techniques too that you might have learned. Techniques like gentle onsets. Now, that brings us to the voice. When we produce speech, we produce our voice. We learned that in the last lesson. So, how are you producing your voice? Well, the voice is made by vibrations of the vocal folds. And the vocal folds rest inside your throat, very low down in your throat, where you're in the lower part of your larynx, and they vibrate. And these vibrations make up the sound of your speech, not the sounds of speech, not the speech sounds, but the sound of your speech. So it is like a vocal buzzing sound. But that's not the way that a lot of people who stutter produce their speech, because sometimes they're trying to get the words out. We're going to discuss that in a minute as well. But when you're trying to get the words out, you might be trying to push them out with your air. So, I don't know. And that is a different way of producing a voice. It's not the Also, you could be using all of the muscles up here and the muscles in the low, underneath your tongue, part of your tongue. You could be using those muscles when you produce a voice. So these are all different variations of the way that the voice might be produced. So that's another thing that some people who stutter do when they're producing speech. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't produce your voice naturally. It means maybe you've gotten into the habit of producing your voice that way instead of the natural way. And another thing that you might be doing is trying to control the movements of your mouth when you're speaking. That is something that, as we said before, cannot be done. You can't control how you're moving your mouth when you are speaking because it just goes too fast for that. So, if you are thinking, I can't say the L sound, so you think, how am I going to say it? And you start trying to control your tongue to make the L sound, you might be having a lot of problems. So this is definitely one of the surprises that we discussed, that the mouth has to move automatically. Now, another thing that we said in the last lesson, I think that was in the last lesson I mentioned it, is that speech is produced in the head. And the normally fluent speaker doesn't try to get words out, doesn't try to get speech out. But people who stutter in one way or the other are trying to get the words out. And this is something that is really, really going to interfere with speaking. I know we all use that. I couldn't get a word out, or sometimes we say I couldn't get a word in edgewise too. So we use terminology like that. But actually, the words don't come out. The language is in the head, it's produced with the voice, and the mouth shapes it. But people who are stuttering are trying to get words out. And to get the words out, you might be using your mouth to try to get the words out. You might be producing your voice incorrectly to try to get the words out. So all of these things will create stuttering. Okay. There's another thing that I want to bring up, and that is that the voice has to be the foundation of our speaking. And for many people, so much energy and so much concentration is put on the mouth that the mouth becomes primary and the voice is secondary. It should be the other way around. So if you're a person who makes your mouth primary and you're trying to do the words and then you add the voice to the words, then you are a person who is stuttering. Whether or not at this moment you have a stutter, you are using a stuttering system. So these are some of the things that people who stutter do. And you know, they're all changeable. I want to put in a little word for parents of children who might be starting to stutter. And you might be asking, how does all this happen? How does this become? How did my child speak fine in one time and start stuttering maybe all of a sudden, or maybe it was gradual? Maybe it was at the age of 3 or 4, where it usually starts, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or maybe it was later in adolescence, because some people do start stuttering in adolescence. You have an understanding that the system is complex and that so many things have to work simultaneously. It could be that at certain times there is a certain bit of too much happening in the system, and some of the parts of the system are not functioning or not up to the complexity of the language or the complexity of the thought. Could be that a person just gets used to not producing their voice naturally. So it could be all of these different things that happen as part of speech development. And speech doesn't just develop in the first few years of life. Speech is developing up through adolescence. So, very often, the speech system does right itself, and it gets synchronized, and everything starts working in the normal, natural way. But sometimes it doesn't. So, in those cases, the person starts really concentrating on how to speak, and this makes it even more difficult to speak. So it becomes a circular thing. There's a certain difficulty, so a person starts thinking too much about how to speak, and then that produces more difficulty. Sometimes the original problem might be dissipated, but because of this circular thinking, because of thinking, I can't speak, it becomes a habit to think too much about speaking. So, this is some of what I wanted you to know. And if you are a parent of a child who stutters, help your child or bring your child to a therapist, speech therapist who understands speech development, and we'll look in to see what parts of the system might not be functioning effectively at that time, and you can help the child strengthen these parts of the system. Or you might, if the child has only been stuttering for a few months, or if it's very sporadic, comes and goes, you might want to wait and see if the system will right itself. But it should be also, if it goes on, your child is stuttering for 6 months or a year, or if it's bothering your child in any way, they're starting to not want to speak so much, then you should see a qualified clinician. So, I hope that this answered a lot of your questions, and if you are a person who stutters, I hope you know that the brain is dynamic. The brain changes, and you can change the way your system is functioning. It doesn't function the same way for you all the time anyway. So that means this is not hard. It might be a real hardwired habit, but it's nothing that cannot be changed. It does require looking at the system, understanding it, doing activities maybe to get yourself to use your system naturally, but it's all doable. And in the next lesson, we're going to look a little bit more at this system and how we go about making these changes. So I hope you'll see me there in the next lesson. Bye for now.